I want you to pay very close attention to what you are feeling right now, because today may bring a realization that you have been unconsciously postponing for much longer than you realize. If the emotional atmosphere around you has felt unusual over this weekend, if your heart has seemed heavier, if your thoughts have been circling around a person or relationship without giving you a clear answer, there is a very specific astrological reason behind that sensation. Today, Monday, August 10th, Venus in Libra forms an exact opposition with Neptune, retrograde in Aries, and this is far more psychologically revealing than it may appear at first glance. You could look at this simply as another planetary aspect, another movement happening in the sky, another date on an astrological calendar, but I do not think that captures what this moment can represent emotionally. This is the kind of transit that can bring a private realization into full awareness. It can place a mirror in front of you and make it much harder to look away from what you already know somewhere inside yourself. You may suddenly recognize that something you believed about a relationship was built partly on hope, partly on projection, or partly on the desire for things to be different from the way they actually are. You may question what you have been accepting, what you have been excusing, and what you have been calling love, when perhaps it was really attachment to an image of what love was supposed to become. And there is another layer developing alongside this opposition that deserves attention, because it changes the way this entire moment could be understood. And I will come back to that later. For now, stay with the emotional process that is already unfolding, because this energy does not suddenly appear only when the opposition becomes exact. You may have noticed signs of it building during the last several days. Perhaps you have felt unusually distant from your normal emotional rhythm. Perhaps there has been a strange pressure inside you, almost as if something is approaching, but you cannot identify exactly what it is. Maybe you have found yourself remembering conversations, questioning someone's behavior, revisiting an old emotional situation, or wondering why something that once felt so convincing no longer feels quite as solid. That uncertainty can be uncomfortable because the mind naturally wants immediate answers. When something does not make sense, we often try to explain it away. We tell ourselves that we are overthinking. We tell ourselves that everything is fine. We focus on the good parts because facing the whole truth might require us to make a decision we are not ready to make. But this is where Venus in Libra becomes especially important. Venus is currently in Libra, its home sign, the place where its qualities are especially strong. Venus in Libra seeks harmony, balance, beauty, cooperation, and emotional peace. It wants relationships to feel mutual and graceful. It wants conflict to soften. It wants people to meet each other halfway. There is nothing wrong with wanting those things. In fact, the desire for harmony is deeply human. The difficulty begins when maintaining harmony becomes more important than maintaining honesty. You can become so committed to keeping the relationship peaceful that you stop admitting what is hurting you. You can become so invested in preserving the beautiful version of a connection that you avoid looking underneath it. You may tell yourself that a difficult moment is temporary, that someone will eventually understand that their behavior has an explanation, or that if you remain patient and loving enough, the situation will eventually become what you hoped it would be. This is one of the quieter psychological traps within Venus in Libra. The desire for balance can sometimes encourage you to negotiate against yourself. You may give more than you receive, because giving feels easier than confronting the imbalance. You may stay silent because speaking honestly could disturb the peace. You may continue believing in the potential of someone because accepting their present reality feels too painful. Then we have Neptune retrograde in Aries, positioned across the sky from Venus. Neptune represents dreams, fantasies, ideals, imagination, longing, and the places where perception can become difficult to separate from desire. It can blur the boundary between what exists and what we deeply wish existed. When Neptune moves retrograde, that process becomes more internal. Instead of simply creating another fantasy to follow, It encourages a review of the illusions already operating within your emotional world. That means the question becomes much more personal. What have you been believing because it is true? And what have you been believing because you desperately needed it to be true? That distinction can become impossible to ignore when Venus and Neptune reach their exact opposition today. The tension between the relationship you imagined and the relationship that actually exists can become increasingly difficult to contain. The distance between expectation and reality can suddenly feel enormous. Something you previously managed to rationalize may no longer make sense. Something you romanticized may appear ordinary. Something you repeatedly excused may finally look like the pattern it has always been. This does not necessarily mean that every relationship is ending or that every person around you has been deceptive. The deeper issue is your perception. The transit can reveal where your emotional vision has been softened, distorted, or shaped by longing. You may discover that you have not necessarily been loving the complete reality of another person. You may have been loving the possibility of them. You may have been filling in missing pieces with imagination because the real version left too many uncomfortable questions unanswered. Perhaps you've been looking at a partner through the lens of who you believed they could become, rather than who they consistently demonstrate themselves to be. Perhaps you have been interpreting small gestures as proof of a larger commitment because you needed those gestures to mean more. Perhaps you have remained attached to memories because the present relationship no longer provides what the past once promised. Or perhaps the situation has taken the opposite form. Maybe you have been enduring behavior that has quietly crossed your own boundaries because you convinced yourself that enough love, patience, understanding, or sacrifice would eventually transform the other person. That belief can become incredibly powerful because it allows you to maintain hope while avoiding the painful recognition that another person has to choose their own change. You cannot create someone else's transformation simply by loving them harder. You cannot force reality to match the version of someone that exists inside your imagination. And when this opposition becomes exact, the emotional distance between those two versions can become much harder to ignore. This is why the experience may feel so personal. It is not simply about whether another person is good or bad. It is about whether the story you have been carrying still matches the reality you are living. You may begin to recognize how often you adjusted your expectations to protect a relationship, how often you minimized your own disappointment so that you could continue believing, and how often you accepted uncertainty because certainty might have required you to act. The most uncomfortable realization may be that the illusion was not always something another person created for you. Sometimes we participate in our own illusion because the truth feels too expensive emotionally. We choose the explanation that allows us to stay. We choose the memory that keeps hope alive. We choose the possibility because the present reality hurts. Yet the moment you see that pattern clearly, something inside you begins to change. What initially feels like loss can become recognition. What feels like disappointment can become clarity. What feels like the collapse of a dream can become the beginning of seeing yourself more honestly. That is why I do not see this energy as something arriving simply to punish you or take something away from you. The deeper meaning is that what cannot survive without illusion may finally have to be seen without it. You may realize that the person you were waiting for was never actually the person standing in front of you. You may recognize that the relationship you were protecting existed partly in your imagination. You may finally understand that your worth does not depend on convincing someone to love you correctly, choosing someone who remains unavailable, or endlessly adjusting yourself to preserve a connection. And that recognition can be both painful and liberating at the same time. So if you've been feeling emotionally strange, do not immediately dismiss it. If something inside you has been asking uncomfortable questions, listen carefully before you rush to silence them. If a relationship suddenly looks different to you, Give yourself enough honesty to examine what changed in your perception. The most important revelation may not be what you discover about another person at all. It may be what you discover about the part of yourself that kept believing, waiting, excusing, idealizing, and hoping. That is where the real psychological turning point begins. And that is exactly where the next layer of this transit becomes even more important. The deepest revelation today may not come from what someone else says or does, but from the story you have quietly constructed inside your own mind. Because Neptune does not always create deception by placing a falsehood directly in front of you. Sometimes its influence is much more subtle. It encourages you to interpret reality through the lens of what you desperately hope will be true. And once that interpretation becomes emotionally comforting, Venus in Libra can make it surprisingly easy to keep accepting it. You may know, somewhere beneath the surface, that something is not balanced, that something is missing, or that a situation no longer feels honest, but confrontation can feel more painful than continuing to believe. So you choose peace. You choose patience. You choose another explanation. You tell yourself that perhaps you misunderstood. Perhaps the timing is wrong. Perhaps the other person is simply going through something. Perhaps everything will eventually return to the way you hoped it would be. That internal agreement between desire and denial is exactly what I believe begins to fracture today. You could suddenly look at a situation that you've been living with for a long time and experience a strange emotional combination that is difficult to put into words. There may be embarrassment because you realize how much you overlooked, but there may also be an enormous sense of clarity because something that once seemed complicated suddenly becomes obvious. You may ask yourself how you managed not to recognize it sooner. You may replay old conversations and notice details that you previously ignored. You may remember moments when your intuition was already speaking, yet you found another explanation, because accepting the obvious would have forced you to confront something uncomfortable. If that happens, do not turn that realization against yourself. Do not decide that seeing the truth late means you were foolish. Do not label yourself as weak simply because you believed in someone or hoped for something better. This is precisely the kind of psychological fog associated with Neptune, and recognizing the pattern now means your awareness has already changed. The important thing is not that you once misunderstood the situation. The important thing is that you can see it differently now. That difference matters. A realization becomes powerful when you stop using it as evidence against yourself and start using it as information about where you are going next. And this process does not belong only to romantic relationships. You could see the same pattern emerge in a friendship, where you have consistently been the person carrying the emotional weight, making the effort, checking in, forgiving, understanding, and maintaining the connection while the other person contributes only when it is convenient. You might suddenly recognize that what you called mutual friendship was actually an arrangement in which you were doing most of the emotional work. It can also appear inside family relationships, especially where you have taken on the role of the person who keeps everyone calm. Perhaps you have learned to swallow your disappointment because speaking honestly might create conflict. Perhaps you became the mediator, the understanding one, the person who absorbs tension so everyone else can remain comfortable. Over time, that role can look like love, but underneath it may be costing you your own boundaries. This is why the theme today is larger than romance. Anywhere you have been protecting an appearance of harmony while quietly sacrificing your own truth can become an area where this transit brings uncomfortable awareness. The same principle can extend into your relationship with money, because Venus has a much wider territory than affection and partnership. Venus also speaks to finances, personal value, material security, and the way you determine what is worth your resources. When Neptune stands opposite Venus, the uncertainty can reach into those areas as well. You might suddenly notice a financial situation that you have avoided examining closely. It could involve a poor investment, an arrangement that appeared more attractive than it truly was, spending habits that no longer reflect what you genuinely value. or a situation in which another person has benefited from your generosity while you continued allowing it because addressing the imbalance felt uncomfortable. The point is not to create fear around money. The point is to recognize that idealization can influence financial judgment just as easily as emotional judgment. Something can appear more secure, more profitable, more generous, or more promising because you want it to be that way. That is why today calls for extra awareness around financial choices. This is not an ideal moment for gambling with your resources, making impulsive purchases, or agreeing to something without carefully examining the details. If a financial opportunity seems almost impossibly attractive, slow down. If someone pressures you to decide quickly, give yourself space. If the details do not feel clear, read the fine print again before committing. Neptune can soften the edges of reality, making an attractive possibility look even more convincing than it actually is. And if you experience a persistent feeling that something does not quite add up, do not automatically dismiss that sensation simply because you cannot immediately prove it with numbers. Your internal response can be useful information, especially when the circumstances themselves are difficult to evaluate clearly. But there is an important reason I do not believe this day should be interpreted only as confusion, disappointment, or emotional exposure. There is another planetary influence arriving alongside the Venus-Neptune opposition, and this additional influence changes the emotional meaning of the entire experience. Approximately 4 hours before the Venus-Neptune opposition reaches its exact peak, Venus forms a trine with Pluto retrograde in Aquarius. A trine is considered one of the more harmonious aspects in astrology, and its presence creates an entirely different undertone beneath the tension of the opposition. Without this Pluto connection, you could interpret the day simply as a moment when fantasies collapse, expectations disappoint you, and uncertainty becomes overwhelming. You might look at something falling apart and assume that the story has ended there. But Pluto introduces another possibility. Pluto becomes the deeper force underneath the surface experience, the part that asks what remains when the comforting story has been removed. Neptune can dissolve the image you created, while Pluto encourages you to examine what is underneath that image. What do you genuinely need? What do you actually value? What are you no longer willing to tolerate? What kind of love, respect, stability, and honesty are you prepared to accept from this point forward? Those questions can be uncomfortable because they require you to move beyond what another person promises and examine what you are willing to participate in. You may discover that the thing breaking today is not your future at all. It may be the belief that you have to settle for less in order to keep someone close. It may be the fantasy that patience alone will transform another person. It may be the identity you built around being endlessly understanding, endlessly forgiving, or endlessly available. It may be the assumption that asking for more makes you demanding, difficult, or unlovable. Pluto can expose those deeper beliefs and force you to recognize how they have shaped your choices. So yes, something may crack today. A romantic expectation may collapse. An idealized image of another person may disappear. A belief about a relationship may no longer survive contact with reality. You may even recognize a version of yourself that has been afraid to ask for what you truly need. But the collapse does not have to become emptiness. What disappears can create space for something more authentic. What was built around fantasy can give way to something grounded in truth. What depended on you ignoring yourself can make room for a relationship with yourself that is stronger and more honest. That is why the Venus-Pluto trine matters so much in the middle of this process. It suggests that beneath the discomfort of seeing clearly, there can also be a deeper process of rebuilding. You are not simply losing an illusion. You are being given the opportunity to understand what is real enough to build upon. Even the people you feel drawn toward during this period may reflect that shift. You may become less interested in those who simply tell you what you want to hear, and more aware of those who challenge you, to become more honest with yourself. The healthier connection may not always be the one that makes you feel immediately comfortable. Sometimes the person who helps you grow is the person who recognizes the parts of you that you have been hiding, not to shame you, but to encourage you to stop abandoning those parts of yourself. There is a difference between someone who confirms every fantasy and someone who can see through your defenses while still respecting what exists underneath them. That distinction can completely change the way you understand love, trust, and emotional intimacy. Suddenly, the transit becomes less like a simple story of losing something, and more like an excavation, a process of removing layer after layer until you reach something honest beneath the surface. But there is one more emotional reaction you need to watch carefully as all of this becomes clearer. When reality finally becomes impossible to avoid, the first instinct may not be acceptance. It may be escape, and that urge to run from what you are beginning to see is something you need to handle with particular awareness now. There is a moment that can come after a difficult realization when your mind immediately searches for somewhere else to go, and I want you to recognize that moment before it takes control of you. When an illusion finally loses its power and something you've been avoiding becomes impossible to ignore. The instinct may be to distract yourself, disappear into endless scrolling sleep until the feeling passes, reach for another drink, or simply act as though nothing happened. That reaction does not make you weak. It is a very human response to emotional disorientation. When you discover that part of the life you were emotionally invested in was supported by a story that no longer matches reality. Your nervous system may want distance before your heart is ready to process what your mind has understood. You may suddenly wish you could go back to the version of the situation that felt easier, even if that version was not entirely true. Neptune can intensify precisely this desire because Neptune is associated with transcendence, escape, imagination, and the impulse to move beyond ordinary emotional reality. When something hurts, the Neptunian response can be to dissolve the boundaries around the pain rather than sit directly inside it. You may want to disappear into entertainment, fantasy, sleep, substances, memories, or anything that gives you temporary relief from the uncomfortable clarity arriving in the present moment. But this is where I want you to make a different choice. Do not rush away from what you are finally seeing. Let yourself experience the truth of the feeling, even if it is uncomfortable. Let the disappointment exist without immediately trying to turn it into something easier. Let the confusion settle before you decide what the situation means. There is a kind of clarity that can only arrive when you stop fighting the emotion long enough to understand what it is trying to reveal. The sting is not necessarily the destination. It can be the doorway. Because Neptune has another expression that is profoundly different from avoidance. The same sensitivity that can blur reality can also open the door to genuine inspiration, compassion, spiritual depth, imagination, and creative expression. When you feel the emotional pressure building, you do not have to force it toward another person. You do not have to send the message you may regret later. You do not have to demand an immediate explanation from someone else simply because you are uncomfortable with what you have realized. Instead, you can give that emotional energy somewhere constructive to go. If you suddenly feel compelled to write, write. If you want to paint, paint. If music begins moving through you, make music. If your body feels restless and movement helps you process what words cannot express, move your body. The point is not to suppress the longing or pretend that the emotion does not exist. The point is to transform its direction. What you feel can become material for creation, instead of becoming another source of conflict. The desire for connection can become art. The sadness can become language. The disappointment can become music. The intensity can become movement. The emotional sensitivity can become compassion that is actually sincere rather than something performed to gain approval. This is one of the more constructive ways to work with the energy. because you are allowing the feeling to move through you without allowing it to dictate an impulsive action. Instead of chasing someone who cannot give you what you need, you can return that energy to something that nourishes you. Instead of trying to force another person to validate your worth, you can reconnect with the part of yourself that already contains value. Instead of escaping the emotional truth, you can allow it to become the raw material for something meaningful. That is where I believe another dimension of this transit becomes visible. There is much more happening in the sky than the Venus-Neptune opposition by itself. And when you step back far enough to see the larger configuration, the meaning becomes much more striking. At this time, the planets are forming what astrologers call a mystic rectangle, a configuration that some people are referring to as the cathedral. This pattern includes Venus and Neptune, along with Mercury, Pluto, and Uranus, creating a rare geometric structure made from oppositions, trines, and sextiles. You do not need to memorize the technical construction to understand why this matters. What matters is the relationship between pressure and support. The Venus-Neptune opposition and the Mercury-Pluto opposition, which reaches its peak on August 11th, create a tense inner cross within the larger pattern. This is where the intensity concentrates. This is where illusions can fracture. This is where hidden information can become visible, where secrets may surface, and where words that have been held back can finally be spoken. The pressure does not remain isolated, however. Around that central tension is another network of harmonious connections, the trines and sextiles that provide structure and support. That is why I find the cathedral metaphor so meaningful. Imagine an old structure whose walls have begun to weaken. From the outside, the process may look destructive. Pieces are coming down. Familiar shapes are disappearing. The environment becomes noisy and uncertain. But underneath that apparent disorder, a framework is already being established for something new. The old walls are not simply being destroyed without purpose. There is a supporting structure capable of holding what comes next. In the same way, the emotional disruption you may experience does not necessarily mean your life is falling apart without direction. It can indicate that an outdated structure is being dismantled, while another structure is already taking shape underneath it. This is why the process can feel simultaneously uncomfortable and strangely purposeful. You may notice conversations becoming more emotionally charged. You may notice people reacting more strongly than usual. You may sense tension in interactions that previously seemed easy. Someone may say something that exposes a truth you have avoided. Another conversation may force you to reconsider what you thought you understood. You may even feel as though the atmosphere around you has become unusually sensitive, as though small things are suddenly carrying much greater emotional weight. If you have been experiencing that kind of atmosphere, you are not necessarily imagining the intensity. This larger configuration is part of the astrological picture being described here, and it points toward a process rather than a single isolated emotional event. Something is being rearranged. The deeper purpose is not simply to make you uncomfortable. It is to challenge the structures through which you relate to people, communicate what is true for you, and present yourself to the world. The old pattern may have depended on pretending that everything was fine. It may have depended on keeping other people comfortable while you remained uncomfortable. It may have depended on avoiding difficult conversations because you feared what honesty might change. But a stronger foundation cannot be built on that kind of false stability. The illusion has to weaken before something more honest can take its place. And this becomes even more significant when you look at what is approaching next. Only 48 hours after the Venus-Neptune opposition, on August 12th, there will be a total solar eclipse in Leo. That timing gives the current emotional clearing another layer of meaning. The events unfolding now can be understood as preparation for what that eclipse is about to bring. You cannot fully step into an authentic and sovereign version of yourself while remaining trapped inside someone else's expectations of who you are supposed to be. You cannot fully claim your own light while continuing to wear an emotional mask simply because removing it might make another person uncomfortable. You cannot move forward with complete self-ownership while still organizing your life around preserving a false version of peace. This is why the Venus-Neptune opposition can feel so exposing. It strips away the performance. It challenges the version of harmony that requires you to hide your truth. It removes the comfort of pretending so that you have the possibility of standing in something more genuine when the eclipse arrives. You may feel emotionally raw. You may feel exposed. You may even feel uncertain because the familiar story is no longer protecting you in the same way. But there is also something powerful about reaching a point where you no longer have to pretend. You can be honest about what you feel. You can recognize what is real. You can stop negotiating against yourself. And then, just hours before the eclipse, Mars enters Cancer, adding another important dimension to this sequence. That movement brings a protective quality into the picture, and it sets the stage for what comes next. Once the illusion falls, your instinct to guard your emotional space is going to kick in hard. You're going to feel this fierce need to protect your peace, your boundaries, your inner world. And honestly, I think you should listen to that. That is not you being cold. That is you recalibrating after seeing the truth. What should you actually do with this energy? So, if you're wondering how to move through today, and honestly the next few days, here is what I would suggest based on everything I have been studying and feeling myself. First, pay attention to what surfaces emotionally. Don't push it down. If a relationship suddenly feels different, if a conversation reveals something you weren't expecting, if an old wound gets triggered, sit with it. I think the information that comes through today is important, and it is easy to dismiss it in the moment and regret it later. Second, be mindful of the people around you. Not everyone is going to handle this energy gracefully. Some people are going to be reactive, defensive, maybe even manipulative, not because they are bad people, but because they are feeling the pressure of their own illusions cracking too. You don't need to absorb their chaos. You really don't. Hold your center. Third, don't make huge decisions today if you can help it. This is a day for seeing clearly, not for acting impulsively. Let the clarity settle. Let the dust clear. The eclipse on the 12th is going to bring its own wave of massive transformation. And I think you'll be in a much stronger position to move forward once you've processed what today reveals. And finally, this is the one that resonates with me the most. Be compassionate with yourself. If you realize you have been believing something that was not true, if you feel that wave of embarrassment or grief or frustration, please do not beat yourself up. Neptune's fog is powerful. It gets all of us at some point. The fact that you are coming out of it now, I really believe that is something to be proud of, even when it does not feel that way yet. You're not falling apart, you're being rebuilt. And I want to end on this because I think it is the most important thing I can say about this entire transit. Maybe things feel unstable right now, or relationships are shifting, or your emotions are all over the place, or you're questioning things you used to be certain about. I do not think that is a sign that something is going wrong. I think it is a sign that something is finally going right. The illusion breaking isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Because once you stop pouring your energy into a fantasy, you suddenly have all this space, this clarity to build something real. And I think what is waiting on the other side of this transit is deeper love, stronger boundaries, and a version of yourself that doesn't need anyone else's approval to feel whole. That voice inside you that has been getting louder lately, the one that keeps saying, something has to change. I believe today is the day it stops being a whisper and starts being impossible to ignore. And I think you are ready for it. Even if it doesn't feel that way right now, the false mirror is breaking. And what is behind it? Just you, the real you. And honestly, I think that is more than enough. All right. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Seriously, it means a lot to me that you stayed through all of this. If this resonated with you and you want more content like this, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And please drop a comment below. I really want to hear what you have been experiencing this weekend. Have you felt the shift? Have things been surfacing in your relationships? Let me know. I read every comment, and I genuinely believe we are all moving through this together. Take care of yourself over the next few days, and I will see you in the next one.